starting off, Gregorian chant is liturgical music. Its function is to support the action that's going on in the liturgy.
Liturgy means basically the work of the people, but it's not work for the people, it's of the people worshiping God together in a formal standard put forth by the church.
Yeah, I think that's what Gregorian chant would be. It would be the liturgical, monophonic, unmetered prayer of the liturgy, sung.
Traditionally, I would say the Gregorian part refers to Pope Gregory the Great. He was within the century after his lifetime, it was already well established he was a lover of music. And so Gregorian was kind of a church adjective to describe something musical of the highest excellence. Gregorian chant, as we know it, was probably compiled a few centuries after Gregory the Great, but possibly during the time of Gregory II. So it would have had like a double meaning of in honor of Gregory the Great, and these chants were also recorded and transcribed at the time of the new Pope Gregory II. So for the first millennium of the church, this music was mostly orally transcribed or orally passed on. You learned it by memory and you passed it on by singing it to somebody else and having them do it by memory. And so then you had groups of people who it was their job to hold these memories, and they were highly local. You had like a Roman school, you had kind of more of a Celtic school, or like a French style. You had some really strange stuff going on in Spain, and it all depended on the musicians that were there and the culture that was there. Around the late first millennium, maybe 7th or 8th century, we have people starting to write down little squiggles over the words that would remind you, okay, do a turn here, do the jump here, hold this note out for a long time, but you wouldn't be able to read it unless you knew the melody already. So it was just a memorization tool at first, and then around the 900s or 1000s, like 1000 AD, you started to have notation that looks more like music that we see today. It had the lines across, it had the notes kind of more evenly spaced. These were square notes as opposed to the round notes that we're used to in the modern age. But they were much more familiar. They'd be much more familiar to us today. Even if you don't know the melodies, if someone explained the system to you, you'd be able to recreate it yourself by looking at the notation. And all that happened really at the prompting of Charlemagne. He wanted uniformity in the Holy Roman Empire. He wanted uniformity in his realm. And he looked to Rome to help him do that liturgically. So he sent his musicians and transcribers and whatnot to get the music from Rome and write it down in a way that everybody across Europe could learn efficiently without having to, pass it on from person to person. They could look at the manuscripts and figure it out themselves. From what I understand, the 8 modes are go back to this idea in ancient Greece that there were different modes of music that conveyed different emotions. And much like anything at the time that we're talking about, a lot was written about it in theory, but not like the technical aspects of it. So probably the church modes sound much different than the ancient Greek modes, And still to this day, they probably have different connotations than what we think of as major and minor music. But there's 8 of them, and they typically go in pairs. There's like 4 basic modes, and then another set of 4 that are kind of mirrors of the first 4. And depending on the church season, if it's a penitential season, you might be using some of those more somber sounding modes as the theorists would have described it. If it was a celebratory season like Easter, you would be using more of the joyous modes. And that was a way for church musicians to kind of classify, all right, what kind of music do we need for this celebration or for this solemnity?
So within the liturgy, Gregorian chant is the standard. It's the preference of the church. Before there's any songs that are sung, before any hymns that are sung, the Gregorian chant with the antiphons and the mass propers and all those other fun things that are sprinkled throughout the liturgy, that has a place of primacy within the church. From the very, very first syllables of the Mass is always a chant. It's always an antiphon. And there's always that concept too of that Gregorian chant lends itself to the liturgy and exists to serve the liturgy. It also does something to invoke within our own minds and hearts when we hear the chant to do something for us, to raise our hearts and our minds to God. I always give the example of Palm Sunday, Mass, to begin Holy Week. The very first things that we hear are Hosanna to the Son of David, but it's chanted in a particular way. Whether it's in English or Latin or a different language, it's always the same chant notation that the church gives us. We don't get to just make up whatever we want when we sing Hosanna to the Son of David. It begins Hosanna, just 2 syllables, those 2 notes, bum bum, which if you go back to the Jewish context, to the very early Christians, if they would have heard that particular historical bum bum, those 2 notes, it indicates that the king is here. Because when they would blow the horns or the trumpets, it's where we kind of get the royal fanfare type of sounding. When you hear a king enter something, it's bum ba bum, bum bum, Hosanna.
One of the most common uses of word painting is in the Alleluia. The Alleluia chant happens right before the gospel, and it changes, the melody changes with every Mass. Like every Sunday is a different Alleluia, but it's almost always the same, that this is a one-word chant that has dozens of notes, and it very obviously just shows like the joy of the soul at the coming of the good news of Christ. So one of my favorite Alleluias goes, Alleluia. And that's just the word Alleluia, but it has this thing called a eubulus, and the eubulus is a long melisma, or string of notes on one syllable, in this case, ah. So Alleluia in Hebrew just means praise God, but the musicians had this style and this habit of showing that they're praising God even beyond the word Alleluia.
And you get that too, like with the Salve Regina, the Marian antiphon, the Marian hymn. Most people are familiar with Salve Regina. It's a more simple tone, although it takes some time to learn. But then there's the solemn one that you hear a lot of the Benedictine and Dominican communities of friars and nuns chanting, which is Salve, and then it goes all over the place.
Most of the composers of the chants are anonymous. They come down to us anonymously. But there's one person that who went out of their way to compose new chants for the community that they served in. That was Saint Hildegard von Bingen. And she was a German nun. She was said to be a mystic. She saw visions of the Lord, of Jesus speaking to her. She was a brilliant woman. Besides writing poetry and music, she was also just a really brilliant person in general. But she wrote chants specifically for her religious community. And she's one of the few names that we can put on Gregorian chant in terms of a composer. Everything else was composed without any need for a name to be put on it. It was just like, we need a chant for this feast, just put something together. After chant, when you have the rise of polyphony, you have simple harmonies going in, that's organum, and it's usually one note against the melody. And we have two really famous names early on from the Notre Dame school, which is Léonin and Perrotin. And they were composers who, like their contemporaries, they composed pretty spontaneously. Like, they were good at improvising. But they, and probably others around them, wanted them to write down their improvisations so that they could teach others to do so as well. So Léonin and Perrotin, it's like a Worcester sauce or something named after that, is how we would say it in American English. And then after them, someone else that I think of as an early composer that used chant and added layers of harmony to it is Guillaume de Michaud, another Frenchman, but he would take a hymn to Our Lady, to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and he would add 2 or 3 harmonies to it and make it something totally unique to him, but also it maintained the melody and the sense that the original chant had. So he's another kind of early adopter, I would say, of an early demonstrator of that style that most composers at the time were just improvising. But musically, there's really only one style of music that started in the church and is only really used for the church, and that's chant, Gregorian chant. For the Western Roman Rite, that's the only style of music that you're like, this belongs to the Catholic Church. You can enjoy it too if you're not Catholic, or if you're not even religious. I know a lot of people who are not any kind of religion and would show up to a Gregorian chant concert or would listen to it to relax, or to meditate or something.
When I speak about the influence and importance of chant, especially to Western society and music, I always go back to one melody that has really formed even our current experience of music, and that's the Dies Irae. It can be found in the opening credits of The Shining, right? That Stanley Kubrick classic, Red Rum, Red Rum. And the melody is dun 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 dun, haunting. Dies irae, dies ira. It was so important. I mean, some of the greatest masterpieces of Western music, even in the classical and romantic period, what were they? They were masses, particularly requiem masses. I think of Mozart's Requiem Mass that he basically wrote for himself, and famously didn't finish himself. So one of his proteges, one of his actual contemporaries that kind of had beef, but he finished it for him. The last thing he wrote was the Lacrimosa, which is part of the sequence, and it's Lacrimosa crying. It's the last thing he wrote.
I think a lot of times people within the church are afraid of Gregorian chant because it sounds old and antiquated, but it's very beautiful. So I would just recommend and challenge people, give it a shot. Listen to some simple chants. Try to learn it. Do you know what is being said? What is it? Why is it frustrating if it is frustrating? Why do you find it beautiful if you find it beautiful? And really wrestle with it, just like you would any cultural type of song. Well, this sounds very different from what I'm used to. Okay, does it make you uncomfortable? Is it interesting? To just give it a shot and see that there is something more than just, it sounds old and pretty and that's just what the church does. There's a reason to it, so dive into that a little bit more and see what you might find.